You got 5 seconds to turn around before base security turns this pier into a very bad memory for you. The voice came sharp through the cold Atlantic rain, cutting across the steel-gray harbor like a snapped cable. Petty Officer Ethan Cole stood beneath the floodlights of Pier 12 with his hands locked behind his back, rainwater dripping from the brim of his Navy cap. At 24 years old, Ethan carried himself with the rigid confidence of a man who believed authority lived entirely in rank insignias and regulation manuals. Behind him, the massive silhouette of the USS Blackstone loomed against the storm clouds, its destroyer hull glowing under rows of white deck lights that reflected across the wet concrete in trembling streaks. Sailors moved up and down the pier hauling equipment crates, their boots thudding against the soaked surface while distant tug horns groaned somewhere out in the harbor fog. In front of Ethan stood an old man who looked completely out of place among the movement and machinery of the naval base. Arthur Hayes didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there with rain rolling down the shoulders of a faded dark blue peacoat that looked older than most of the sailors on the pier. His silver hair clung damply to his forehead, and one weathered hand rested lightly on the handle of a worn leather duffel bag sitting beside his boots. He wasn't tall anymore. Age had bent his posture slightly forward, but there was something about the stillness in his pale blue eyes that made the chaos around him seem distant. Ethan hated that look instantly. It was calm in a way he couldn't control. "Sir," Ethan said louder, stepping closer, "this area is restricted to active duty personnel only. Visitors don't just wander onto a naval pier during storm prep." Arthur finally lifted his gaze toward the destroyer behind Ethan. The ship's radar mast sliced into the rain-dark sky like a black spear. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then his gravel-rough voice came low and steady. "She used to look smaller." Ethan blinked once, caught off guard by the response. A pair of younger sailors nearby chuckled under their breath. One elbowed the other and nodded toward Arthur's old coat and sea bag. Ethan smirked. "What, you served back in the dinosaur days?" More laughter. Arthur didn't react. He kept looking toward the destroyer as rainwater tapped softly against the concrete around them. Somewhere farther down the pier, a warning bell rang twice as deck crews secured equipment against the incoming weather front. Ethan stepped directly into Arthur's line of sight now, forcing the old man to look at him instead of the ship. "I asked you a question, sir." "Identification." Arthur slowly reached into his coat pocket and handed over a worn visitor pass along with a driver's license from Virginia Beach. The plastic edges were cracked from age. Ethan studied it with exaggerated seriousness. "Arthur Hayes," he read aloud. 84 years old. He looked up again, amusement spreading across his face. "You get lost looking for the retirement cruise terminal?" The sailors behind him laughed louder this time. Arthur took the insults without expression. That bothered Ethan even more than arguing would have. Most civilians got nervous around uniforms. This old man just stood there listening to the rain hit the steel deck of the destroyer. Ethan handed the ID back with 2 fingers like it was something dirty. "You can't stay here." Arthur nodded once toward the ship. "I'm expected." Ethan actually laughed out loud now. "Expected by who?" Arthur's eyes stayed steady. "An old friend." "Right," Ethan said. "And I'm guessing this old friend outranks the entire Atlantic fleet?" Arthur hesitated just long enough for the rain and harbor wind to fill the silence between them. Then he answered quietly. "He used to." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable." Another sailor walked over carrying a tablet under his arm, slowing down when he sensed the tension. Ethan noticed the audience forming and straightened his posture immediately. He could feel the attention now. That dangerous little thrill of public authority. "All right, Grandpa," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Let's make this simple. What rank were you supposed to be?" The sailors smirked and exchanged looks. Arthur's weathered fingers tightened. Almost invisibly around the strap of the old leather duffel bag. For the first time since Ethan approached him, the old man looked directly into his eyes. The harbor wind howled between the destroyers. Rain hammered against steel. And in the middle of Pier 12, Arthur Hayes answered in the same calm voice he'd used from the beginning. "Vice Admiral." For half a second, the only sound on Pier 12 was the rain hammering against steel and concrete. Then the sailors around Ethan Cole exploded into laughter. One sailor nearly dropped the coil of rope in his hands. Another slapped the wet railing beside him and shook his head in disbelief. Even the deck crew farther up the pier turned to look at the old man standing beneath the floodlights with rainwater running down his faded peacoat. Ethan grinned wide, savoring every second of it. "Vice Admiral," he repeated loudly. "Of course you were." He looked around at the gathering sailors. "Gentlemen, apparently we have royalty standing on the pier tonight." More laughter rolled across the dock. Arthur Hayes stood motionless in the middle of it, one hand resting lightly on the old leather sea bag at his feet. The yellow harbor lights reflected in the puddles around his boots while cold wind carried the sharp scent of diesel fuel and seawater through the air. Ethan waited for embarrassment to appear on the old man's face. It never came. Arthur simply looked back toward the USS Blackstone again, his pale blue eyes tracing the destroyer's silhouette through sheets of rain. That calmness started irritating Ethan in ways he could not explain. "All right," Ethan said, taking another step closer. "Let us say I believe you for a second. Vice Admiral Hayes. What exactly are you doing standing outside a destroyer pier without clearance, without escort, and dressed like you wandered out of a fishing town diner?" Arthur answered without looking at him. "Waiting." "For who?" "Someone who remembers." Ethan scoffed. "You know what I think." Arthur remained silent. Ethan folded his arms. "I think you are one of those old guys who hangs around military bases telling stories nobody can verify anymore. Every year we get a few of you. Fake patches. Fake medals. Fake ranks." A couple sailors nodded along behind him. One of them muttered, "Probably watched too many war movies." Ethan smirked. "Exactly." Arthur finally shifted his gaze back toward the young petty officer. There was no anger in his expression. No challenge either. Just a tired stillness that somehow made Ethan feel younger than he already was. "You done?" Arthur asked quietly. Ethan blinked once. The old man's voice had not risen at all, but something in the question landed heavier than expected. Before Ethan could answer, a deep ship horn suddenly rolled across the harbor. The sound vibrated through the pier beneath their boots. Sailors instinctively glanced toward the water as the storm intensified over the Atlantic. Wind pushed rain sideways now, rattling loose chains against steel cargo hooks. Arthur's eyes lifted slightly toward the destroyer again. "Still sounds the same," he murmured. Ethan threw his hands out dramatically. "Unbelievable." He pointed toward the security checkpoint farther up the pier. "You are leaving. Now." Arthur did not move. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Did you hear me?" Arthur bent slowly beside the old sea bag and adjusted the worn leather strap. The movement caused the edge of something metallic to briefly slide into view near the partially open zipper. Ethan noticed it immediately. A coin. Old. Thick. Brass-colored. Navy Challenge coins were common enough on base, but this one looked strange. Larger than normal. Darkened with age. One edge carried an engraved crest Ethan did not recognize. He stepped forward before Arthur could close the bag completely. "Hold on." Arthur's hand stopped. Ethan crouched slightly and grabbed the coin between two fingers before the old man could react. "What is this?" Rainwater dripped from Ethan's sleeve onto the weathered brass surface. The crest stamped into the coin showed an eagle above an old Atlantic Fleet insignia Ethan had only seen once in a training slideshow at Annapolis orientation. Except this version looked different. Older. Sharper. Almost ceremonial. The sailors nearby leaned in curiously. Wow, one of them laughed. Vintage pirate money. Ethan flipped the coin over in his hand. The backside carried only 4 engraved words beneath a faded navy crest. Hold fast through the fire. Ethan frowned slightly. Something about the phrase felt familiar, but before he could place it, Arthur spoke for the first time with something colder beneath his voice. Do not spin that. Ethan looked up. The rain streaked down Arthur Hayes's lined face while harbor lights reflected faintly in his eyes. The old man had not moved from his spot, but the atmosphere around him felt different now. Heavier somehow. Ethan forced a grin anyway. Or what? Arthur held his gaze for several quiet seconds while the wind howled across Pier 12. Then he answered softly. It belonged to men who never came home. The laughter around Ethan faded just a little. The rain kept falling hard across Norfolk Harbor, drumming against the steel hull of the USS Blackstone with a hollow rhythm that echoed through the night air. Nobody on Pier 12 seemed eager to laugh anymore. Ethan Cole still held the heavy brass coin between his fingers, but the smug confidence on his face had faded slightly. There was something about the way Arthur Hayes had spoken that unsettled him. Not loud. Not threatening. Just certain. The kind of certainty that did not need approval from anyone standing there. Ethan looked back down at the coin again. Hold fast through the fire. The engraved letters were worn smooth at the edges from decades of handling. He rubbed his thumb across the faded crest and noticed tiny scratches cut into the brass around the eagle insignia, almost like shrapnel marks frozen into metal. You expect me to believe this belongs to some secret admiral club? Ethan asked, forcing sarcasm back into his voice. Arthur slowly zipped the sea bag shut again. No, he said quietly. I expect you to hand it back. The answer irritated Ethan immediately. Around them, sailors pretended to stay busy while openly listening now. One crewman carrying mooring equipment had stopped walking altogether. Another leaned against a crate near the security checkpoint, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. Storm winds rolled through the harbor, snapping loose canvas covers against railings with sharp cracking sounds. Ethan flipped the coin once more in his hand. You know what I think this is? Arthur remained silent. Ethan smirked. I think some gift shop near the boardwalk sold you a fantasy. One sailor chuckled nervously, but the reaction was weaker this time. Arthur's pale blue eyes stayed locked on the coin. Not on Ethan. On the coin itself. Like he was somewhere else entirely. Then, slowly, the old veteran spoke again. December 17th. 1979. North Atlantic. The harbor noise around them seemed to fade beneath the calm roughness of his voice. 40-foot waves. Ice forming on the deck rails. Engine alarms screaming through the carrier at 2 in the morning. Ethan rolled his eyes dramatically. Here we go. Arthur ignored him completely. Men slipping on frozen steel because the deck tilted hard enough to throw helicopters against their chains. Smoke filling hangar bay 2. Rainwater rolled from the brim of Arthur's pea coat as he spoke, but his eyes no longer seemed focused on the harbor in front of him. They looked through it. Beyond it. There was a fire below deck, he continued softly. Electrical systems failed first. Then communications. Ethan shifted uncomfortably without understanding why. Arthur's voice never changed volume, but every sailor listening had gone completely still now. Even the wind seemed quieter between sentences. Most of the junior officers wanted evacuation procedures immediately, Arthur said. They were good men. Smart men. But panic spreads fast on a carrier in rough seas. Ethan forced a laugh. And let me guess. You saved everybody. Arthur finally looked at him again. There was no pride in his expression. No dramatic emotion. Just exhaustion buried deep beneath decades. No, he answered. Not everybody. The answer landed harder than Ethan expected. For several seconds nobody spoke. Rain hammered against steel containers stacked farther up the pier while foghorns groaned out in the darkness beyond the harbor mouth. One of the younger sailors shifted his footing awkwardly. Another lowered his gaze toward the wet concrete. Ethan suddenly realized he was still holding the coin. He tried to hand it back casually, but Arthur did not reach for it immediately. "You know," Ethan said, attempting to regain control of the conversation, "people can make up any story they want these days. Especially old military stories." Arthur nodded once. "That is true." Ethan blinked, surprised by the agreement. Arthur finally extended his weathered hand. Ethan placed the coin into it. The old veteran closed his fingers carefully around the brass piece like it weighed far more than metal should. "Most stories disappear because the men inside them stop talking," Arthur said. Somewhere behind the group, boots suddenly pounded across the pier at a fast pace. The sound cut sharply through the storm. Several sailors turned at once. A senior enlisted man in a drenched Navy jacket was approaching quickly from the operations building near the checkpoint. His silver chief insignia flashed beneath the floodlights as rain poured off his shoulders. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reeves rarely hurried anywhere. 22 years in the Navy had given him the slow steady posture of someone who understood ships, storms, and sailors better than most officers ever would. But the moment his eyes landed on Arthur Hayes standing beneath the harbor lights, Reeves stopped dead in the middle of the pier. The color drained from his face almost instantly. Ethan noticed it immediately. "Chief." Reeves did not answer. His eyes were fixed entirely on the old brass coin now resting in Arthur's hand. Wind whipped rain across the pier between them while the destroyer's navigation lights glowed faintly through the fog behind Arthur Hayes. And for the first time that night, somebody wearing the uniform looked genuinely afraid to speak. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reeves stood frozen in the rain like he had just seen a ghost walk out of the Atlantic fog. Water streamed off the brim of his cover and down the shoulders of his soaked jacket, but he did not seem to notice. His eyes remained locked on the brass challenge coin resting in Arthur Hayes's weathered hand. Around them, the activity on Pier 12 slowed almost to a stop. Sailors carrying gear paused beside stacked cargo crates. Deck crews near the destroyer ramp lowered their voices. Even the storm itself seemed distant beneath the strange tension tightening across the harbor pier. Ethan Cole frowned in confusion. "Chief." Reeves finally blinked once, pulling himself back to the present. "Where did you get that coin?" His voice came lower than usual. "Careful." Arthur studied him quietly for a moment before answering. "Long time ago." Reeves stepped closer through the rain. His boots splashed hard against the wet concrete, but his posture carried none of the relaxed authority Ethan was used to seeing from him. This was different. Reeves looked unsettled. Deeply unsettled. "Sir," Reeves said slowly, "that crest was retired before I even enlisted." Ethan scoffed immediately. "Exactly. Which means anybody could fake it." Reeves turned toward him so sharply that Ethan almost took a step back. "Be quiet, Cole." The words cracked through the storm air harder than the harbor wind. Ethan stared in disbelief. Reeves had corrected him before, but never with that tone. Not publicly. Not in front of sailors. Reeves ignored Ethan completely after that. His attention returned to Arthur and the old brass coin. "Hold fast through the fire," Reeves murmured almost to himself. "I have only heard that phrase once." Arthur's expression did not change. "Then you heard it from somebody old enough to remember." Reeves swallowed visibly. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his jaw as he looked past Arthur toward the USS Blackstone looming against the dark harbor. "My father served aboard the USS Valorant," Reeves said quietly. He talked about a carrier fire during the winter Atlantic operations in 1979. Ethan folded his arms defensively. "So what? Old sailors tell stories all the time." Reeves looked at him again, but now there was genuine warning in his eyes. Not this one. The younger sailors nearby had gone completely silent. One of them shifted uneasily beneath the floodlights while another slowly lowered the clipboard he had been carrying. Arthur slipped the coin carefully into his coat pocket. The motion was deliberate. Respectful. Like returning something sacred to its place. Your father still alive? Arthur asked. Reeves nodded once. Retired Master Chief. Lives in Charleston now. Arthur looked back toward the harbor lights shimmering through rain and fog. Good city. Reeves stared at him for several long seconds before speaking again. My father said there was an admiral during that fire who refused evacuation. Ethan rolled his eyes immediately. Oh, come on. Reeves ignored him again. He said the man stayed below deck organizing damage control teams while smoke filled the lower corridors. Arthur's gaze remained fixed on the destroyer in the distance. Your father remembers too much. Reeves gave a nervous half-laugh that carried no humor at all. No, sir. He said everybody else remembers too little. A gust of Atlantic wind swept across the pier hard enough to shake loose cables hanging beside the docking station. Metal clanged against metal somewhere farther down the harbor while warning lights flashed red along the Blackstone's upper deck. Ethan suddenly realized every sailor nearby was listening now. Watching. The mood had changed completely from the easy mockery earlier. Nobody was laughing anymore. Reeves took another slow step forward. Sir, he said carefully, what was your assignment during the Valorant incident? Arthur finally looked directly at him. Harbor lights reflected faintly in the old veteran's pale blue eyes. Executive Command Oversight. Ethan snorted. That sounds like a made-up answer. Reeves did not even glance at him this time. The executive officer aboard the Valorant died in the fire, he said quietly. The acting command authority assumed temporary fleet coordination until rescue operations stabilized. Ethan's confidence faltered slightly. And? Reeves looked straight at Arthur now. The acting command authority was never officially named in the records. Silence settled over Pier 12. Rain hissed against steel railings while the destroyer's running lights cut through harbor fog like distant stars. Arthur said nothing. That silence itself felt like confirmation. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention of the other sailors. Chief, seriously, you are not buying this old sea story, are you? Reeves answered without taking his eyes off Arthur Hayes. My father once told me there are two kinds of veterans. Wind curled through the pier again, carrying cold salt air between the rows of docked ships. The first kind never stop reminding people what they did. Reeves paused. The second kind spend 40 years trying to disappear. Ethan opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, the radio clip to Reeves's shoulder suddenly crackled alive through the storm. The sharp burst of static made several sailors jump. Then a tense voice came over the channel. Chief Reeves, report immediately. Repeat, immediately. Reeves slowly reached for the radio without looking away from Arthur Hayes. And for the first time that night, Ethan Cole felt something cold settle deep in his stomach. The radio static hissed through the rain like a warning flare in the dark. Chief Reeves pressed 2 fingers against the receiver clipped to his shoulder while keeping his eyes fixed on Arthur Hayes. Chief Reeves responding, he said carefully. The voice on the other end sounded tense enough to cut through the storm itself. Operations Command needs immediate confirmation. Did you say Arthur Hayes? Reeves hesitated only briefly. Yes. Silence crackled across the channel for 2 long seconds. Then the voice returned lower. Stay where you are. Do not escalate the situation. Repeat, do not escalate. Ethan Cole frowned immediately. Escalate what situation? Reeves slowly lowered the radio from his shoulder. Rainwater streamed down his face beneath the harbor floodlights while sailors nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Arthur stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, one hand resting lightly on the strap of the old sea bag. Calm. Motionless. Like the storm itself had decided not to touch him. Ethan laughed nervously. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. Nobody joined him this time. Reeves stepped closer to Arthur. Sir, he said quietly, operations is checking archival command records right now. Arthur nodded once. That means somebody older finally answered the phone. The sentence landed strangely hard. Ethan folded his arms tighter against the cold harbor wind. You cannot seriously believe this guy was some hidden admiral. Reeves looked toward him slowly. You ever hear of the Black Winter incident? Ethan blinked. No, most people have not. Reeves glanced back toward the destroyer looming through the rain. Naval historians barely mention it anymore. Carrier fire during Cold War exercises north of Iceland. Electrical failures. Communications blackout. Severe weather. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on the harbor. 47 degrees below freezing with the wind chill, he murmured. Ethan shifted uncomfortably again. Reeves continued quietly. Official reports say command coordination broke down for nearly 30 minutes. One sailor nearby whispered under his breath, that is impossible on a carrier. Reeves nodded faintly. Exactly. Thunder rolled somewhere far out over the Atlantic. The low vibration passed through the harbor steel beneath their boots while fog drifted slowly between the docked ships. Arthur reached into his coat pocket and touched the edge of the brass challenge coin again. The simple motion seemed unconscious. Muscle memory from another lifetime. When systems fail at sea, Arthur said softly, rank stops mattering real fast. Ethan shook his head. Then why say you were a Vice Admiral? Arthur finally looked directly at him again. Because you asked. The answer silenced Ethan completely. Rain hammered against stacked cargo containers farther down the pier while warning lights blinked red across the USS Blackstone's upper mast. Reeves stared at Arthur carefully now, as if trying to solve a puzzle he had only heard pieces of his entire career. My father once said the acting commander during the Black Winter incident vanished from public records afterward, Reeves said. No interviews. No ceremonies. Nothing. Arthur gave the faintest shrug beneath his soaked peacoat. Public attention was never the job. Ethan noticed something then that made his stomach tighten again. Reeves was standing straighter now. Not casual anymore. Almost formal. The kind of posture sailors unconsciously used around senior command. Ethan opened his mouth to object again when another burst of radio chatter suddenly exploded across the pier. This time multiple channels crackled at once from different sailors clipped into harbor operations frequencies. Voices overlapped sharply through static and rain. Command vehicle inbound. Clear Pier 12 access lane immediately. Repeat, senior command approaching. Several sailors looked toward the operations building in confusion. Ethan frowned harder. What is going on? Reeves did not answer immediately. His eyes had narrowed toward the road leading down to the harbor gate. Through the sheets of rain, faint headlights were now cutting across the darkness beyond the security checkpoint. Not one vehicle. Multiple. Black government SUVs moving fast through the storm. Ethan laughed again, but now it sounded thin and forced. No way. Arthur slowly adjusted the collar of his old peacoat against the cold wind. You should not stand in the rain without gloves, he said calmly to Ethan. Atlantic weather gets into your joints after enough years. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. That is what you are worried about right now? Arthur looked back toward the approaching headlights reflecting off the wet pier concrete. No, he answered quietly. What worries me is that somebody important finally remembered my name. The convoy drew closer. Red and white harbor lights flashed across black vehicle hoods slick with rainwater while sailors instinctively moved aside along the pier. One young deckhand nearly dropped a cargo manifest when he saw the lead vehicle carry a 4-star command flag mounted beside the windshield. Ethan's face drained of color almost immediately. Reeves inhaled slowly through his nose. "Oh no," he whispered under his breath. The first SUV stopped hard beside the pier entrance. Its doors had not even opened yet, but every sailor on Pier 12 already knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever had just arrived was not coming for Ethan Cole. The convoy doors opened almost simultaneously beneath the cold harbor rain. Uniformed security officers stepped out first, scanning the pier with the sharp mechanical precision of men trained to protect people whose names carried weight far beyond Norfolk Harbor. Their boots splashed through puddles beneath the floodlights while the storm winds whipped long coats against their legs. Then the rear passenger door of the lead SUV opened slowly. Every sailor on Pier 12 straightened instinctively. Vice Admiral Richard Bowman stepped out into the rain without waiting for an umbrella. At 63 years old, Bowman carried the kind of presence that changed the atmosphere around him the moment he entered a space. His dark overcoat moved sharply in the Atlantic wind, for silver stars visible at his collar beneath the harbor lights. Conversations died instantly across the pier. Even the deck crews farther up near the Blackstone seemed to freeze where they stood. Ethan Cole felt his pulse hammer inside his chest. He had only seen Bowman twice before, both during formal command inspections where entire ship crews had spent weeks preparing for his arrival. Seeing the Vice Admiral standing 30 feet away in the middle of a storm felt unreal. Reeves immediately snapped to attention beside Arthur Hayes. Other sailors followed half a second later, boots locking hard against the wet concrete. Ethan reacted slower than everyone else. His brain still struggled to connect what he was seeing with the old man standing quietly beside him holding a worn leather sea bag. Bowman did not acknowledge anyone else on the pier. Not the security detail. Not the destroyer crew. Not the operations officers now hurrying out from the harbor building. His eyes were fixed entirely on Arthur Hayes. The Vice Admiral walked forward through the rain without hesitation. Water streamed down the shoulders of his coat while harbor lights flashed across the soaked concrete between them. Ethan swallowed hard as Bowman stopped directly in front of Arthur. For a brief second neither man spoke. The storm roared around them. Wind rattled chains against dock posts. Somewhere out beyond the harbor breakwater, thunder rolled low across the Atlantic. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone watching, Vice Admiral Richard Bowman stood straighter and gave Arthur Hayes a full formal salute. The movement snapped through the rain with razor-sharp precision. Every sailor on Pier 12 froze completely. Ethan felt all the blood leave his face. Bowman held the salute several seconds before speaking. "Sir," he said quietly, "nobody informed me you were coming tonight." Arthur looked almost embarrassed by the attention. He returned the salute slower, older, but no less steady. "I did not think the Navy still remembered invitations from 40 years ago." Bowman lowered his hand carefully. "The Navy remembers you every day." Silence spread across the pier like a pressure wave. Ethan stared openly now, unable to process what he had just witnessed. Reeves kept his eyes forward, but even he looked shaken. Arthur glanced toward the destroyer behind them. "She is a fine ship." Bowman followed his gaze toward the USS Blackstone glowing through sheets of rain. "Not as fine as the one you saved." Ethan's stomach dropped. Around him, sailors exchanged stunned looks while the realization spread through the group all at once. Arthur Hayes was real. Every story. Every rumor. Every impossible detail. Real. Bowman finally turned slightly toward the rest of the pier. His eyes landed on Ethan Cole. The temperature in Ethan's chest seemed to collapse instantly beneath that stare. "Petty officer," Bowman said calmly. Ethan snapped upright so fast his boots nearly slipped on the wet concrete. "Sir." Bowman's voice never rose. That made it worse somehow. "Would you care to explain why Vice Admiral Arthur Hayes is standing in the rain outside my pier checkpoint?" Ethan opened his mouth once. Nothing came out. Rain drummed against the steel deck of the destroyer while every sailor on the pier watched him struggle for air. "Sir, I did not know," Bowman cut him off quietly. "No. You did not." Ethan's throat tightened. Arthur stepped slightly forward before the silence could crush the young sailor completely. "Richard," he said calmly, the young man was doing his job. Bowman looked back toward Arthur immediately, and the edge in his expression softened at once. "With respect, sir, there is doing the job." He glanced once more toward Ethan. "And then there is forgetting what the uniform is supposed to stand for." The sentence hit harder than any shouted reprimand could have. Ethan stared down at the rain-soaked concrete beneath his boots, unable to meet anyone's eyes anymore. Bowman looked back toward Arthur Hayes again. "Sir," he said carefully, "there are officers inside who have spent 20 years hoping to meet you." Arthur gave the faintest tired smile beneath the harbor lights. "That seems unlikely." Bowman shook his head once. "No, sir. What seems unlikely is that you disappeared for 4 decades and still managed to become a legend anyway." The storm rolled heavier over Norfolk Harbor as Vice Admiral Richard Bowman escorted Arthur Hayes across Pier 12. Sailors moved out of their path instinctively, boots splashing through shallow rainwater while floodlights reflected off soaked steel and concrete in long shimmering streaks. Nobody spoke above a whisper anymore. The atmosphere had changed too completely for that. Ethan Cole remained standing near the checkpoint with his hands stiff at his sides, watching the old man walk beside one of the most powerful officers in the Atlantic Fleet like it was the most natural thing in the world. Every instinct inside Ethan told him he should say something. Apologize. Explain. Defend himself. But the words stayed trapped somewhere behind the pounding in his chest. Arthur glanced briefly toward the destroyer towering beside the pier. "She handles rough weather better than the older carriers did," he said quietly. Bowman gave a faint smile beside him. "Modern stabilization systems help." Arthur nodded once. "Men helped more." The Vice Admiral's expression softened for just a second beneath the cold harbor lights. Reeves followed several steps behind them with the stunned silence of a sailor witnessing history he never expected to see firsthand. Younger crew members trailed farther back pretending to continue their duties while openly staring. One sailor near the mooring station whispered under his breath, "That is really him." Another answered quietly, "Apparently." Ethan finally forced himself to move. He stepped away from the checkpoint and hurried through the rain toward Bowman and Arthur. "Sir," he called out. Bowman stopped immediately. The temperature around the group seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Ethan swallowed hard as every pair of eyes on the pier shifted toward him. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his cap down the side of his face, but he barely noticed anymore. "Sir," he repeated more carefully, "I did not mean any disrespect." Bowman studied him silently. Arthur remained calm beside him, one hand resting lightly on the strap of the old leather sea bag. Ethan looked toward the old veteran directly now. "I just thought," he stopped. The sentence collapsed halfway out of his mouth because he suddenly realized how small it sounded. Arthur saved him from finishing it. "You thought old men stop mattering after retirement?" Ethan stared downward immediately. Arthur's voice stayed calm. Not angry. Somehow that made the shame worse. "That is becoming more common these days." Bowman folded his hands behind his back beneath the rain-soaked overcoat. "Petty Officer Cole," he said quietly, "do you know why the Navy still teaches damage control procedures based on the Black Winter incident?" Ethan shook his head once. "No, sir." Bowman looked toward Arthur. "Because every modern evacuation protocol we use today exists because this man refused to abandon 600 sailors during a systems collapse in the North Atlantic." Silence spread across the pier again. The destroyer's deck lights glowed through the storm fog while distant thunder rolled low over the harbor mouth. Ethan felt his throat tighten painfully. Bowman continued. When communications failed and half the carrier command staff panicked, Arthur Hayes kept the ship operational long enough for rescue coordination to stabilize. Arthur looked irritated now more than proud. Richard. Bowman ignored him gently. He turned down public commendations afterward. Reeves inhaled slowly behind them. Why? Arthur answered before Bowman could. Because sailors died. The words landed with crushing simplicity. No drama. No performance. Just truth. Wind swept rain sideways across the pier while somewhere aboard the USS Blackstone a bell rang twice through the fog. Ethan finally understood something then that none of his training manuals or inspections had ever taught him. The old man, standing in front of him, did not carry authority because of rank insignias or medals or stories. He carried it because he remembered every sailor who never made it home. Bowman looked toward the harbor water for a long moment before speaking again. There is a reason senior command still studies the Hayes Doctrine during emergency response training. Ethan blinked in confusion. The what? Reeves looked genuinely shocked now too. Bowman gave the faintest smile. Officially it is called Fleet Survival Prioritization Procedure. He glanced toward Arthur. Nobody uses the official name. Arthur shook his head slowly. That is ridiculous. Bowman almost laughed. Sir, there are officers inside the Pentagon who quote your reports like scripture. The old veteran looked deeply uncomfortable hearing that. He adjusted the collar of his weathered peacoat against the Atlantic wind and stared back toward the destroyer instead. Ethan watched him carefully now. Really watched him for the first time all night. The old sea bag. The faded coat. The tired posture. None of it mattered anymore. Because beneath all of it stood a man who had once carried an entire ship through chaos while everyone else broke apart around him. Bowman turned toward the operations building glowing beneath the floodlights farther up the pier. There is a command dinner waiting inside, he said quietly. Half the admirals attending still think you are dead. Arthur sighed softly. I was hoping for coffee and silence. Bowman's faint smile returned. Unfortunately for you, sir, legends do not get quiet evenings. The operations building overlooking Pier 12 glowed warm against the cold Atlantic storm, its tall windows reflecting streaks of rain and harbor light across the soaked pavement outside. Inside, senior officers from across the Atlantic Fleet stood gathered beneath polished brass Navy emblems and framed photographs of ships long retired from service. Dress uniforms filled the room with dark fabric, gold braid, and rows of ribbons earned over decades at sea. The low hum of formal conversation drifted through the command hall alongside the faint clink of coffee cups and silverware. Then the front doors opened. The room fell silent almost instantly. Vice Admiral Richard Bowman stepped inside first, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his overcoat. Behind him walked Arthur Hayes carrying the same worn leather sea bag he had carried across Pier 12. The contrast between the room and the old veteran could not have been sharper. Admirals stood beneath crystal lighting in immaculate uniforms while Arthur looked like a tired old sailor who had wandered in from the harbor docks after 40 years away from the fleet. Yet the moment several officers recognized his face, the atmosphere inside the command hall changed completely. One rear admiral near the coffee station froze with the cup halfway to his mouth. Another officer turned pale so quickly it looked almost painful. Near the far wall, a gray-haired captain whispered softly under his breath, "That cannot be him." Bowman removed his wet gloves slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "I believe some of you have been asking for proof that legends occasionally survive retirement." Nobody laughed. Arthur looked deeply uncomfortable beneath the attention now settling across the room like weight. He shifted the sea bag slightly against his shoulder and glanced toward the windows overlooking the harbor rain. "Richard," he muttered quietly, "this was a mistake." Bowman ignored the comment completely. "Vice Admiral Arthur Hayes," he announced. The title hit the room harder than thunder. Several officers straightened instinctively. Others simply stared. One commander near the center table whispered, "My God." Arthur gave a tired sigh beneath his breath. "I told you not to do that." Bowman stepped aside slightly, allowing the room a clearer view of the old veteran standing there in the faded peacoat. "The architect of the modern fleet survival protocols," Bowman continued. "The acting command authority during the Black Winter incident." Silence. Pure silence. Ethan Cole stood near the doorway now with Reeves behind him, both soaked from the harbor rain. Ethan had never seen senior officers react like this before. These were admirals. Carrier commanders. Men whose names appeared in military journals and Pentagon briefings. Yet half of them looked at Arthur Hayes with the same expression sailors used around memorial walls and folded flags. One elderly rear admiral slowly approached Arthur through the quiet room. His silver hair was cropped short beneath years of military discipline, and his left hand trembled slightly with age as he stopped in front of the old veteran. "Sir," he said softly, "my father served aboard the Valorant." Arthur's eyes lifted carefully. "What was his name?" "Thomas Mercer. Damage Control Division." Arthur became very still. "Red hair?" The admiral blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir." Arthur nodded once toward the floor. "He kept 3 lower compartments from flooding after the generator collapse." The admiral's expression broke almost instantly. "He spoke about you until the day he died." Nobody in the room moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Arthur looked uncomfortable again hearing it. "Your father did his job. He said you saved the ship." Arthur shook his head slowly. "No," his pale blue eyes drifted toward the storm outside the harbor windows. "The crew saved the ship." The sentence carried the kind of quiet honesty that only old sailors understood. Bowman looked around the room carefully now. "There is another reason Admiral Hayes is remembered," he said. "After the Black Winter incident, he personally refused commendation ceremonies unless every surviving enlisted sailor received recognition first." Several officers lowered their eyes slightly at that. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Earlier that night he had mocked this man in front of sailors barely old enough to understand what real command even looked like. Arthur adjusted the collar of his old peacoat again, visibly uncomfortable beneath the attention filling the room. "You officers still talk too much," he muttered. A faint ripple of restrained laughter moved through the hall. Gentle. Respectful. The kind reserved for someone nobody wanted to embarrass. Then one commander near the back of the room slowly rose to his feet. He stood straight and formal beside the long command table. Another officer followed. Then another. Within seconds every officer in the command hall was standing silently at attention facing Arthur Hayes. No order had been given. No command spoken. The room simply understood. Ethan watched the old veteran's expression shift almost imperceptibly beneath the warm command hall lights. Not pride. Not satisfaction. Something quieter than that. Something older. Arthur lowered his eyes briefly toward the floor before speaking in a voice roughened by age and memory. "Easy now," he said softly. "I am just an old sailor who stayed afloat a little longer than most." The storm finally began to ease over Norfolk Harbor sometime after midnight. Rain still tapped softly against the tall command hall windows, but the violent Atlantic wind had faded into a low steady hum rolling across the dark water outside. Inside the operations building, nobody seemed eager to leave. Senior officers who normally guarded every second of their schedules now stood quietly around Arthur Hayes like sailors gathered around the last surviving lighthouse in a storm. Coffee had long gone cold on polished tables. Formal dinners sat untouched beneath silver covers. None of it mattered anymore. Arthur rested near the large harbor windows with a cup of black coffee warming his weathered hands. The old leather sea bag sat beside his chair exactly where he had placed it. He looked smaller sitting down somehow. Older. The flood of attention throughout the evening had clearly exhausted him, though he would never admit it aloud. Vice Admiral Richard Bowman stood nearby speaking softly with several commanders while Reeves remained respectfully close to the doorway. Ethan Cole had not moved far from the wall since entering the room. He felt like a ghost haunting his own humiliation. Every replay of the night hit harder than the last. The mocking tone. The laughter. The coin in his hand. The way he had looked at Arthur Hayes and seen nothing worth respecting. Ethan finally gathered enough courage to step forward. His boots felt unusually heavy crossing the polished floor. Several officers noticed him approach but said nothing. Arthur looked up from his coffee as Ethan stopped in front of him. For a second the young petty officer almost lost his nerve completely. Then he stood straighter. "Sir," Ethan said quietly, "I owe you an apology." The room fell still again. Arthur waited patiently. Ethan swallowed once. "I judged you before I knew who you were." Arthur's eyes remained calm. "That happens." Ethan shook his head immediately. "No, sir. That is not enough." His voice tightened slightly. "I forgot what the uniform is supposed to mean." Nobody interrupted him. Outside the harbor windows, navigation lights from the USS Blackstone shimmered softly across the dark Atlantic water. Arthur looked down into his coffee for a moment before answering. "Most people think respect comes from rank." Ethan listened carefully now. "It does not." Arthur lifted his eyes again. "Rank only tells people where you stand." His voice stayed low and rough with age. "Character tells them whether you deserve to stand there at all." The sentence settled heavily across the quiet command hall. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the floor. "I understand now, sir." Arthur gave the faintest tired smile. "No," he said gently. "You are beginning to." Bowman watched the exchange silently from across the room, his expression unreadable beneath the warm overhead lights. Arthur slowly reached into his peacoat pocket and removed the old brass challenge coin once more. He held it carefully between weathered fingers before extending it toward Ethan. The young sailor blinked in confusion. "Sir." "Take it." Ethan hesitated before accepting the coin with both hands this time. The brass felt heavier now than it had earlier out on the pier. Almost warm despite its age. Arthur nodded toward the engraved words beneath the faded crest. "Read it again." Ethan looked down. "Hold fast through the fire." The letters seemed sharper somehow beneath the quiet light of the command hall. "That coin belonged to sailors who stayed at their stations when fear told them to run," Arthur said softly. "Not because they were fearless. Because other people depended on them." Ethan stared at the coin silently. Arthur leaned back slightly in the chair beside the harbor windows. "One day you will supervise young sailors of your own." Ethan looked up immediately. "Yes, sir. And they will learn more from the way you treat people than from any regulation manual you ever memorize." Ethan felt his throat tighten painfully again. Arthur nodded once toward the coin. "Keep it tonight." Ethan's eyes widened. "Sir, I cannot, you can." Arthur's voice carried quiet finality now. "Just remember why it matters." Silence settled warmly through the room. Not uncomfortable anymore. Respectful. Human. After several seconds Arthur slowly pushed himself upright from the chair with visible stiffness in his shoulders. Bowman stepped forward immediately. "Sir, your car is ready whenever you are." Arthur glanced once more toward the harbor outside. The rain had nearly stopped now. Beyond the glass, the USS Blackstone rested quietly against Pier 12 beneath the fading storm clouds. "Beautiful night," Arthur murmured. Ethan looked toward the harbor too. "It was raining an hour ago." Arthur gave a faint smile without looking at him. "The ocean clears eventually." Bowman escorted him slowly toward the exit while officers throughout the command hall straightened instinctively once more. Nobody spoke as Arthur Hayes passed by. They simply stood there in silence, watching an old sailor walk through the room carrying nothing but a weathered sea bag and 40 years of memory. Just before reaching the doorway, Arthur paused briefly beside Ethan one final time. "Petty officer." Ethan snapped upright immediately. "Sir." Arthur looked at the young sailor for several quiet seconds before speaking. "Some men spend their whole lives demanding respect." The old veteran's pale blue eyes drifted briefly toward the harbor beyond the windows. "The best ones never have to ask for it at all."